of his work in getting her to this point in this process. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
That's what you spoke about at the hearing. You don't feel right away.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington State is recognized.
Mr. President, I join my colleagues from the Northwest to come to the floor this afternoon to speak in support of the nomination of Sarah Jewell as Secretary of Interior. And like my colleagues from the Northwest, I want to express how much we appreciate her willingness to serve and how proud we are of her legacy and interest in a variety of issues so far. And obviously, the Department of Interior, with its broad range of services, is so important to us, including everything from our national parks to wildlife refuge to offshore drilling lease management to the important science done by the USGS service and many, many other things. In fact, I read somewhere kind of humorously that the Department of Interior was called the Department of Everything Else. So I know that as a nominee, Ms. Jewell came before our committee, and I want to thank her family for their willingness to support her in their efforts to come to Washington, D.C., because Sally is the exact type of leadership we need at the Department of Interior. She represents a balanced person who not only knows how to help a growing business like she did or served on the University Board of Regents, also worked on the nonpartisan National Conservation Parks Association. But she has been everything in business, from dealing to oil fields in Oklahoma to commercial banking to, of late, running REI, one of our most successful companies in the Pacific Northwest. So I know she has the kind of leadership that it takes to figure out these issues about best use of public lands or the vigorous challenges the department faces when it comes to modernizing the bureaucracy or thinking about climate change at the same time you're talking about deep water drilling. So it's a myriad of things that we have to forge through, and Sally Jewell is the right person with the right balance to get that done. Having grown up in Washington with over 40% of our land, where 40% of our land is in public land, I know that Sally understands these Western issues, whether it's water rights or salmon recovery or understanding the impact on water levels, fire season, wildlife on BLM lands, or the importance of access to hunting and fishing. I guarantee, because she grew up there, Sally Jewell understands these issues. And I know that she's been involved in many organizations to express that, and that has been a good training ground for her. I'm confident because she is a trained engineer. She's going to bring a very pragmatic, can-do attitude to the Interior Department's management and problem-solving efforts. I know that science will be her compass, and I know that she's not going to have an ideological bent, but she's going to have a get-it-done mentality. Given the importance of the Interior Department's agencies and very, very challenging mission, I'm excited that we're going to have somebody with a business background and a science background at the Department of Interior. So I hope that our colleagues will vote today to move Ms. Jewell out of the United States Senate so that we can get her into the Department of Interior so that she can begin this important job and continue to move our nation's agenda forward. As the chairwoman of the Indian Affairs Committee, I look forward to working with Ms. Jewell on all the issues related to Indian country as well. There's much to accomplish and much to address, and I think that her background is exactly what we need in the United States Senate, so I hope my colleagues will move quickly on this issue, and I thank the chairman, Senator Wyden, for his leadership in moving her nomination through the process.
Mr. President, before she leaves, I just want to thank Senator Cantwell for all her good work. I think Northwesterners know, and I hope the rest of the country knows, that Senator Cantwell is one of those who really understands the opportunity in the great outdoors. I know you're climbing a mountain this summer and rounding into shape. You're always fit and getting ready for a mountain, and particularly to have the opportunity to work with folks in the Pacific Northwest, particularly with Sally Jewell's background, as you have eloquently outlined, I think is going to be an advantage, not just for our region, but for the rest of our country. I see our colleague from New Mexico is here, and if he would like to make some remarks at this point, we'd welcome him. I have some additional remarks as well. Would my colleague from New Mexico like to make any remarks at this time? All right. Mr. President, let me then talk for just a few more minutes about Ms. Jewell and some of the challenges ahead, particularly in natural resources. Obviously, with authorities, as my colleagues have outlined, that range from managing national parks to offshore oil and gas development to protecting fish and wildlife, if you're going to serve as Secretary of Interior, it's almost like an extreme sport for multitaskers. You are going to have to juggle, and Ms. Jewell knows a little bit about multitasking, as we've outlined, from being a petroleum engineer, a CEO, a conservationist, and a banker. And particularly in my part of the world, Oregon, there are some especially important challenges. The federal government owns most of our land. And particularly in forestry, we need to find a way to bring together all sides, timber owners, environmentalists, scientists, and we need to go in there, Mr. President, and clean out millions and millions of overstocked timber stands. We can get that material to the mills. It's an ideal source of biomass, a clean source of energy. And because we're working to build relationships with the environmental community, we can also find a way to protect old growth as we get the harvest up. But it's not, again, going to happen just by osmosis because somebody waves a wand in Washington, D.C. It's going to happen because you have responsible administrators like Sally Jewell who really are going to take the time to learn the checkerboard pattern of O&C lands in our local communities, and particularly understand some of our traditions that have worked particularly well in the past, and I think can be of great benefit as we look to future solutions. Mr. President, back in 2000, I had the honor of writing the Secure Rural Schools Bill, the Timber Payments Bill, with our former colleague, Senator Larry Craig. And what we included in that legislation, I think, is the kind of model for collaborative forestry that I think you're going to see Sally Jewell pick up on. We established something called Resource Advisory Councils, Mr. President, where in effect on the local level, people from the timber industry, people from the environmental community, scientists, a whole host of others, frankly, some people who, as a general rule, hadn't done much talking to each other, probably done a lot of litigating against each other. They would use these resource advisory councils to come together and try to find some common ground. And it worked. These resource advisory councils, when I meet people from the timber industry, from any of the extractive industries, and environmental folks, they say, use that model, use that collaborative model that we're seeing used in timberlands in southwestern Oregon as a way that we can really build on the opportunity to bring people together. We've been able to do that with Forest Service lands in eastern Oregon to some extent, Mr. President. I think we can do it also in western Oregon and in the communities that are affected by Bureau of Land Management lands. Probably to do it, we're going to have to extend the timber payments law for another year to give us the time to come up with a long-term solution. I've talked about this with Sarah Jewell in the past, and I think her willingness to see that this is an issue that now finally has to be addressed in a way that will get the timber harvest up in the ONC lands, but also protect our treasures, our old growth. This is some of the really pristine treasure of America. And, Mr. President, if we don't figure out a way to promote forest health and go in there and thin out these overstocked sands, these fires that we're seeing, and they're not natural fires, they're really magnets for infernos because of years and years of neglect, are going to continue. And I think Sarah Jewell is really up to the challenge of coming up with the kinds of policies for the ONC lands, for the lands we're seeing in eastern Oregon, and what many of my colleagues have talked about in Montana and Colorado and Idaho, and I think she is up to that challenge. Now, Mr. President, before we wrap up today, I do want to take a few minutes and talk about, I know the President of the Senate has great affection for him as well, our former colleague Ken Salazar. Ken Salazar, as you know, has been Secretary of the Interior throughout the Obama administration to date, and it's my view that he has done an exceptional job. And I think we all understand here in the Senate that when Ken Salazar is involved, you get somebody with a great smile, an enormous amount of energy, enormous intelligence, and someone who in a very persistent way is interested in solving problems. And Ken Salazar has sure done that, Mr. President, in a number of important areas. For example, before Ken Salazar, took office, and I'm just looking at a headline, there was a huge scandal at the Department of Interior. I'm looking at an article in the fall of 2008, headline, Sex, Drug Use, and Graft Cited in the Interior Department. And basically what it talks about is a review, a number of reports delivered by the Inspector General that basically document, Mr. President, at the Department of Interior, a culture of lax ethics. And it basically, describes how something like a dozen current and former employees at the Minerals Management Services, is an agency that collected at that time billions of dollars of royalties, annually. You basically had an anything goes kind of environment. The reports go on and on. It feels more like a litany for a late-night television show. The reports focus on a culture of substance abuse and promiscuity and what was the service's royalty and kind program, essentially officials that seem to be exempt from expense account limits. One ethical lapse after another was documented in these reports. And I remember, Mr. President, the hearing, the confirmation hearing on Senator Salazar, and it was unusual because he had been my seatmate over the years at the Department of Energy, and we said, Senator Salazar, you have got to go in there and drain the swamp at the Minerals Management Service. And in fact, he certainly did that. It has been essentially the successor, has been a program free of scandal, and I think that is representative of both the integrity and the professionalism that Secretary Salazar has brought to the program. He also, I would note, after the Gulf spill, overhauled the offshore drilling practices, ensured that they were beefed up in terms of safety, while at the same time allowing for the drilling that is so important to the industry. And I'm also going to, as we reflect on Secretary Salazar's accomplishments, mention that he has done yeoman work in terms of promoting green and renewable energy. I note in one of the comments about his departure that Christy Goldfuss, Public Lands Director at the Center for American Progress, stated, and I quote here, Secretary Salazar championed a new model of conservation which focused on partnerships with private landowners and states, and that this approach has paid off with cooperatives in the Everglades in Florida, the Prairie Pothole region of the Dakotas, and other areas. And I'd like to note as well that Secretary Salazar, and I know senators on both sides of the aisle would call them when they had those kind of resource questions that I know Senator Murkowski brought up, is one of Secretary Salazar's final acts in office today. Under his leadership, the state of Idaho and the Fish and Wildlife Service entered into an arrangement so that the state of Idaho's plan for addressing the sage grouse could be implemented. I know that this is a critical issue for Senator Risch. He and I have talked about it often. I'm going to continue to work with him on these issues, and what Secretary Salazar did today is an example of the new kind of partnership that we ought to look to the Interior Department and the states for, and it's certainly something that I want to promote, and I know Senator Murkowski shares that view. So I think it's fair to say, Mr. President, that Sally Jewell has very large boots to fill. We all remember Secretary Salazar's wonderful Western boots and the anecdotes about them, and she's certainly got a challenge to try to step in after a secretary who has accomplished so much. But as I and Senator Murkowski and the Washington senators have outlined today, we believe strongly that Sally Jewell is up to this job. I hope she will receive a resounding vote here in the United States Senate. I believe that we are close to the point when we will be able to vote on Ms. Jewell, and I think for all the reasons that I and my colleagues have outlined this afternoon, I hope there will be very strong bipartisan support for Ms. Jewell when we vote later in the evening. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor. And I would note also, Mr. President, the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Again.
I ask unanimous consent that all, in fact, I ask unanimous consent to vacate the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that all remaining time on the Jewell nomination be yielded back.
Is there objection? So ordered. All time is yielded back.
Mr. President, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered. Clerk will call the roll.
Did you guys say the question?
Mr. Alexander.
I wasn't reading
Ms.
the
Ayotte.
script. I was going
Ms.
to my
Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckidge. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Please. Thank you. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo.
Did you get me?
Yeah, I got you. But I didn't know you were back there.
No.
Otherwise.
Well, I figured, I
Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donley, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Blumenthal, Brown, Heinrich, Inhofe, Isaacson, Murray, and Wyden. No senator voting in the negative. Mr. Beckich, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Cowan, aye. Mr. Johans, no. Mrs. Fisher? Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Rono, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Alexander? Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Aye. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Paul, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Carper? Aye. Mrs. Hagan? Mrs. Hagan? Aye. Mr. Chambliss? Mr. Chambliss? No. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Bozeman? Aye.
Ms. Murkowski?
Aye. Mr. Blunt? Aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye.
Have all the senators wished to vote? Are there other senators wishing to vote or change their votes? If not, the ayes are 87, the nays are 11. The nomination is approved. Under the previous motion under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered, made, and laid upon the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. President.
May we have order?
Mr. President, tomorrow at 11 o'clock we're going to vote on cloture. On the motion to proceed to the gun legislation that's now before this body. This morning, throughout the day, our friend from Connecticut, freshman senator, who was brought to the Senate with this tragedy having taken place shortly after he arrived here in the Senate. My friend, the presiding officer, longtime Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer of the state of Connecticut, has lived with this tragedy that happened in Sandy Hook like nothing that ever happened in your career. And for, of course, Senator Heinrich, new senator here, this was something that he never appreciated that he would be faced with. I saw the pictures today, these little babies that were murdered. Some of them shot multiple times. Little tiny kids shot multiple times. The shooting was on December 14th, about 4 months ago. 120 days. So, Mr. President, the time has come, it's arrived, when we have to debate this issue. We have to have a response to this tragedy. This incident took place on December 14th, struck me like it did everyone in America, virtually everyone in America. We'd been through Aurora, Colorado, that vicious, brutal machine gunning of people coming to watch a movie, and then little kids getting killed. In an elementary school, kindergartners, first graders. So we need to respond, this great deliberative body, to what the American people want. So we're going to vote. It's time to vote. I hope we get cloture on this matter, Mr. President. We certainly should. After that, there's no reason not to start legislating immediately. I hope we don't have to go through this procedural mishmash, 30 hours, somebody on the floor all the time. If you don't, there's dilatory tactics, only one quorum call, and all this. Let's get past that. If somebody has something to say, come and say it. But this week, we're going to start legislating. We're going to start legislating whether there's cloture or not. One will be a little longer process. But we're going to start legislating on this bill this week. I hope we can get to it tomorrow. And I don't think it's any secret. If we're on this bill, I'm going to, the first amendment in order will be the amendment to change the background checks that has been worked on for weeks by Senator Manchin, Senator Kirk, Senator Toomey. And then we'll decide where we go from there. All my friends, we're going to have amendments on this. Some of them are going to take a little bit of time. We're not going to finish the bill this week. I don't know if we'll finish it next week. But that really doesn't matter. Are we going to legislate the right way? Are we going to legislate? Because I have in my mind these little children who are murdered. Now, what we do here is not going to prevent all gun violence in America. But, Mr. President, if we stop a few, isn't that remarkably important for us to do? I think we can do a lot more than saving the lives of just a few people. But let's work on this bill. We're going to start we have to use up to 30 hours, we use up to 30 hours. If there are ways around that procedurally, I hope we don't have to test that. There are a number of amendments. We all know, we've been reading about them. There are lots of amendments I can't comprehend. I don't know because people have been waiting for a long time for this legislation. One of my Republican colleagues yesterday said, I have a number of germane amendments I want to offer. I said, fine, good, do it. We know we have to do background checks, the assault weapons, the ammunition capacity clips or magazines, mental health. That's just to name a few of the things. And I repeat, we're going to begin this process before we leave here this week. I so appreciate the work done by Senator Manchin, Toomey, Kirk, and many others. We've had my friend Senator Schumer has been working on this. My friend Dick Durbin, who's been involved in guns for a long time, has been involved in this. And I appreciate the work of everyone. And I hope, as the press has indicated, that we're likely going to get cloture on this tomorrow. I hope so. But as I've told individual senators, if we don't get cloture, we are going to have a vote in the United States Senate on capacity clips, assault weapons, the background checks, and some mental health items or item. That we're going to do. I hope that we can do it in the regular process. We've had people for a long time now, my friends on the other side of the aisle, saying, we want regular order. We want to be a law for amendments. Well, I do too. And I hope that people will be, not see how many amendments they can offer, not to see if they can set a record for how many amendments can be laid down, because we should have this as a civil process and culminating in a better set of laws for people in this great country that we live in, and for those of us who have the opportunity to try to address this issue. I hope that we all understand that the world's watching what we do.
Mr. President. Mr. President, earlier this afternoon I had the opportunity, the honor, to chair a hearing of the Senate Judiciary Committee on which we serve, to consider the President's nomination of a highly qualified lawyer, Sri Srinivasan, to serve on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And I'm encouraged by what the Majority Leader has just said about the very real possibility we will get a vote on the floor of this Senate on vital and important issues affecting guns, immigration, and other issues. But what I speak to today is the absolutely essential role that this Senate must fill of voting on qualified judges who've been nominated to the circuit courts of the United States. Earlier today in this hearing, 10 of our colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, asked thoughtful questions, and Mr. Srinivasan gave thorough and thoughtful answers. I came away convinced that he has the background, the education, the skills, and most importantly, the temperament to serve as a circuit court judge. And I was encouraged by comments of my colleagues, both Republican and Democrat, that they too were inclined to support this nomination. Under normal, historical circumstances, today's hearing would be the beginning of a deliberate, timely, orderly process, a process required of this body by Article 2, Section 2 of our Constitution, by which we advise and consent to the President's nominations. We should, of course, carefully consider the qualifications of candidates and not serve as some rubber stamp. But neither should we be a firewall, blocking qualified nominees from service. And unfortunately, for some number of years, this Senate has in some vital instances served more as firewall than as advice and consent body. Instead of doing our due diligence with appropriate speed, we've seen delays, stalling tactics, and in some instances, sadly, filibusters of highly qualified nominees. 5 years into President Obama's administration, the courts are still nearly 10% vacant. In my view, our courts should be above politics, and when the president of either party submits a highly qualified candidate of good character and sound legal mind, absent exceptional circumstances, that candidate's entitled to a vote. The actions, or in this case, inaction of the Senate with regards to the D.C. Circuit have consequences. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals has a series of vacancies, the result of which, in my view, are delayed and denied justice for Americans far beyond the boundaries of this District of Columbia. The D.C. Circuit Court is often called the second most important in the nation because, like the Supreme Court, it handles cases that impact Americans all over our country. It regularly hears cases on issues ranging from terrorism and detention to the scope of federal agency power, and yet it is critically understaffed. This circuit court hasn't seen a nominee confirmed since President George W. Bush's fourth nominee to that court was confirmed in 2006. Today, more than 1,500 days after President Obama has taken office, 4 of the 11 seats on the D.C. Circuit are open, making it more than a third vacant and putting the remaining judges under undue strain to decide the complex and important cases before this court. Contrary to the previous administration, this administration was recently recognized by the New York Times editorial board as putting forward nominees who are decidedly moderate. President Obama first nominated for this vacancy on this court the exceptionally qualified Caitlin Halligan, who waited more than 900 days for a simple up or down vote on the floor of this chamber. She came with the American Bar Association's highest rating, glowing recommendations from bipartisan supporters, and a diverse legal career marked by distinctive service as New York Solicitor General. Nevertheless, sadly here, Republican senators successfully filibustered her nomination, and last month President Obama reluctantly withdrew Ms. Halligan from consideration. We have today a chance for a fresh start with Mr. Srinivasan, who would serve equally well and ably on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. As he demonstrated in today's hearing, he has a sharp and capable legal mind. He served in the Solicitor General's office for both Republican and Democratic administrations. He has served in the private sector and the public sector and has earned bipartisan support from those who have worked with him. In fact, he's been endorsed publicly in a letter from 12 former Solicitors General and Principal Deputy Solicitors General, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans, or those who've served in Democratic and Republican administrations. The letter, signed by conservative legal luminaries such as Paul Clement and Ted Olson, notes Mr. Srinivasan is one of the best appellate lawyers in the country, with an unsurpassed work ethic, who is, quote, extremely well prepared to take on the intellectual rigors of serving as the D.C. Circuit Court judge. At the same time, throughout the course of his career in private practice and as a public servant, he's represented clients with causes diverse enough that any individual policymaker or elected official is likely to disagree with some of them, including me. I disagree with the position he argued in Rumsfeld versus Padilla in support of the idea that the government has a right to detain U.S. citizens indefinitely. But I don't ascribe that position to him. One of the most foundational principles of our legal system is that you do not ascribe to the attorney the position which he successfully and vigorously advocates on behalf of his client. I will not block his nomination simply because I might disagree with the position he took on behalf of a client in one case. Sri, in my view, is a highly capable attorney with the character and demeanor to serve on the bench, and I will strongly support his nomination. I am following in this instance the wisdom of Chief Justice Roberts, who has said, and I quote, "It's a tradition of the American bar that goes back before the founding of our nation, that lawyers are not identified with the positions of their clients," close quote. So I say to my colleagues here, let's move forward in that spirit. Let's return to our historic, constitutionally mandated role. Let's give Mr. Srinivasan a speedy up or down vote, which I believe he's earned, with decades of public service and private sector experience. To be honest, Mr. President, if this nomination cannot move forward, if this nomination is filibustered for what really can only be political reasons, I can't imagine what nomination could move forward to this court. A filibuster of this nominee would sadly prove to me, just as it did to those of the other party in 2005, that the judicial nomination standards and procedures at work here are unworkable, the system broken, and it would lead to a reconsideration. There was a crisis just of this sort when the parties were of opposite configuration in 2005 that led the majority to threaten the so-called nuclear option to end judicial filibusters by the party in which I serve, a result that was avoided only at the last moment for the good of the Senate and the nation. I urge my colleagues to come together to give this good man a vote and avoid another such crisis today. Let's do our job so that the judges of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals can do theirs for the people of our nation. Thank you. And with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,